All right, everyone. The White Death is coming back. Yes, indeed. Three more cases of tuberculosis clustered in Portland, Maine. Right now, the threat is relatively low. We had gotten tuberculosis to record lows in the United States. Like it was only a few thousand cases a year. Now it's climbing up back towards 10,000 a year and still rising. This could be a big problem, and the cause is painfully obvious. The cause is easily clear. It's a mixture of illegal immigration and migration in general, along with the decrepitude of certain very crowded areas in the country where you have large groups of people who are homeless. In many cases, they're on drugs and so forth. People from those backgrounds have lowered immune systems. Now, here's the thing about tuberculosis. Most people don't know anything about it. And we'll talk about the vampire scare in New England briefly as well. Tuberculosis is usually asymptomatic. Most people who get tuberculosis in the Western world will not have no symptoms whatsoever. The tuberculosis, though, can be inside of your body for an extended period of time, dormant, and then it gets triggered when it's no longer suppressed by a proper immune system. So if a person is not malnourished, they're not immunocompromised or anything like that, probably, if they do get tuberculosis, they're not going to get sick from it. They might carry it. The odds of them transmitting it to anyone is very, very small. You have tuberculosis tests still for a reason. It was called the White Death because it cut down millions and millions of people in its heyday, back during the Victorian era, back before people had proper nutrition, and they tended to live in more crowded conditions in their villages and towns and stuff. They weren't very sanitary, and so people's immune systems weren't as beefy as they are now. Because you're not getting enough food. Your body doesn't have as many resources to actually apply to that. A lot of people still had effectively a bread and beer diet with some cabbage soup, and that was the norm for half the population. What happened with the New England vampire scare, by the way, this was tuberculosis related, is back then they didn't have the modern germ theory. They had what is called miasmatic theory. They thought that sickness generally was caused by foul air. So swampy air and sometimes bad air coming down from the mountains, hot and dry and stuff. I can't remember. A subscriber told me what that was called, and chamomile typically utilized for treating it. But it's a kind of like a mountain wind, and it causes depression and stuff. So they believed in miasmatic theory. They realized if you hang around graveyards and rat-filled swamps and stuff, you get sick. Well, obviously, it's something in the air. They didn't have a modern conception of germ theory. What they noticed, though, troubled them. With tuberculosis, it tended to cluster in families. One person got sick, then another person got sick, then another person got sick, and it was people that were in proximity. If it was miasmatic theory that was right, then everyone should be getting sick because the miasmus doesn't stop at one house and then go over to the other, now does it? That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. And it didn't seem to respect your religion or care how many times you prayed to Mary or anything like that. People were dying. And they got to thinking that there must be some central source of this. And they also didn't understand the decomposition process very well. Of course, when you killed something, typically you immediately gutted it and it would stay good for a while because there's no guts inside of it to bloat or anything like that. And then you eat it fairly quickly, if it's an animal. With humans, they'd seal them up as quick as possible. There were people that were buried alive because of their non-embalming process. And then they were buried as quickly as possible, or they were put in the mausoleum for burial in colder climates like New England if it was impossible to axe through the ground. Now, what they noticed is that in some cases, it appeared that these corpses weren't decomposing at all. They had blood trickling from their mouths and they looked like they had been alive recently. They didn't realize that when the corpse is frozen and very slowly thaws out and then begins to, crepitate, that it takes a while for that body, sealed in a box in a mausoleum away from, you know, basically the elements, it takes a while for them to actually rot at all. And so what happened is they thought these people were coming back from the dead and were literal vampires. And so it spread in families because they would, vampirize their family members and then get them sick with the same disease. They would eventually die and become vampires themselves. So they started driving stakes through the hearts of the dead to keep them from coming back. They would immolate bodies, although not generally. Sometimes they were buried at a crossroads. The thought was that the cross would hold them in. They had iron grating. There's actually a tuberculosis grave in Woodstock, where I grew up. There was this metal grate around, a spot on the ground with a gravestone next to it, and I was like, "What's that?" And apparently, it was to keep the vampire from coming back. They started doing this. It also helped dissuade grave robbery, by the way. So that was also a concern. Well, anyway, that's your history lesson of the day. Tuberculosis is coming back big time. If you go from 2,000 cases to 9,000 cases in a year, you can say over the course of only a couple of years, that's a pretty decent spread. Now, thankfully, time is on our side because we're trying to solve the problem of people coming into the country. You do realize that about a third of the world is infected with tuberculosis, right? That's most common in the undeveloped world. This is the developed world, and it's becoming much, much more common. Thankfully, though, again, time is on our side because it doesn't spread very readily. And typically, the only people that are going to be tuberculosis major spreaders are people that are malnourished and shit. The problem is that you now have a bunch of malnourished masses piling into the country from areas where tuberculosis is still relatively common. So this could become a problem. We do have time to reverse the situation. Number one, by getting rid of the open borders policy and doing basically what we're doing. Number two, probably more expansive testing. I mean, tuberculosis in theory, with a worldwide effort, we probably could eradicate it. It's just it would take a monumental amount of effort and money that nobody wants to spend. They don't give a shit if some tribesmen in Africa keel over and die. They care if they keel over and die, but they live in gated communities, so they don't have to be around the unwashed hordes like ourselves. That's about all. Peace out.